Okay, folks, welcome back to Battle for Azeroth. Wanted to do a state of for Retribution. I did the war campaign again to see the other choice you get to make, and the only way to do that is to complete the war campaign again. So, played as Retribution through that, and while the thoughts were still fresh in my mind, I thought we would do a state of. So, I have played a Paladin before. Retribution's probably the spec I've played the least, so this is going to be more of a true kind of first impression. I did find a setup that worked, though. I was pleasantly surprised with the ease in which I was able to kind of set everything up and figure it out and play, and also how much I actually enjoyed it. So, wasn't too bad. I don't have too many gripes. As far as spells go, I really don't remember. I can't see where anything major has changed aside from obvious changes. You have 2 blessings now. Well, 2 buffs now, rather, I should say. Rather than just the blessing of kings that you had before. Other than that, I really, it's pretty much like the other specs. I really don't. I know some things probably have gotten shifted around, taken away, and whatnot, but from what I can remember, it's pretty much about the same. You have about what you need. You have a good amount of spells, and the way that I have them arranged now is pretty similar to how I have the abilities for protection set up. It's just your abilities in Retribution are more focused on damage, of course, than survivability. There are quite a few similarities, though, so you shouldn't have too much trouble switching back and forth if DPS, tanking DPS was more your thing. So, yeah, if I was to critique anything, I would say that I noticed Divine Storm didn't work quite as well as I had hoped. It does a decent amount of damage, it just didn't seem to work quite as well as what I'd hoped. I had no trouble, I mean, at different points with Avenging Wrath active and, getting your different procs and whatnot. I was one-shotting some just like low level, well, I say low level, but just, your average common kind of mobs. I was pretty well one-shotting them. So, the different rare kind of mini bosses you had, the elites, I guess they would be, didn't have too much trouble there. I kind of saved my Avenging Wrath for that. You really don't have a big cooldown, so occasionally would need to pop a shield or something, but nothing outrageous, nothing out of the ordinary. So that, I think, was probably my biggest. That, and if I had a true complaint, it would be that I at first I thought my the thing I noticed was it seemed like I was having trouble keeping my health up. And then I realized that Blessing of Kings actually gives you a shield that absorbs damage. So with that up and just getting a little more comfortable with my abilities, that kind of minor problem solved itself. The one thing that I did notice from start to finish was that I had trouble generating holy power, which is really, really strange. I have abilities that generate holy power. About everything you have does. Crusader Strike does. Blade of Justice is your big Holy Power Generator generates 2, has 2 charges, and it can be 1 charge, excuse me. And it can be used at range. So it's actually a spell. It's not actually a melee ability. So, and then Judgment does. The thing with that is all your abilities use 3 Holy Power, and a lot of the talents use 3 Holy Power that you can choose to take as well. So it really doesn't benefit you to kind of stack up abilities that require Holy Power, because you can't really seem to generate enough of it too. I didn't have any trouble. There were just different parts where if I had a lot of mobs on me, or as it goes, completing a quest, or you're trying to find something, you end up stopping to take care of 2 or 3 mobs, and then kind of a patrol wanders in, and then you end up with 1 or 2 more on you, what have you. Those kind of situations, I found myself at times not really able to do anything because everything was on cooldown. If they wanted to fix something, they could go back through and take another look at the cooldowns, because they're a bit all over the place. And if you didn't have... It got a little better when I started shifting the talents around. That just seemed to be my consistent thought playing, was I can't do anything. You usually have 1 ability or 2 that you can kind of go to when you're kind of went through your rotation and you're waiting for things to reset. And didn't quite seem to be the case on Retribution. So that's why I said I can't really remember anything missing. However, as I said, I really didn't play Retribution that much. So with the other specs, I know with Holy, I played Holy probably the most of any of the 3 specs, and there really wasn't a lot of changes to that. So I'm assuming it's fairly similar with Retribution at this point. As far as the talents go, that is my setup, my build. Shifted some things around, as I said. So with Holy, the talents were somewhat divided up. Like 2/3 were healing, utility, what have you. 1/3 was kind of talents that interacted with your damaging abilities. And I noticed that looking through these talents, it's a combination of Holy Power abilities and then just kind of passives and utilities and whatnot. So it's a bit strange kind of how they have the talents here. And I will admit, some of these seem kind of wonky at first, especially when you put them kind of in combination together with themselves. However, as I said, they actually all worked pretty well together. I was pleasantly surprised. I was fairly well geared. I reached 120 while time walking was going on. So I did time walking as I was leveling up. I did the quest to get the epic piece of gear. I did the intro to Najar. Got that gear. So I was better geared than perhaps I would have been under normal circumstances. I do spec for Holy, so all the gear I get and everything, my loot specialty is on Holy. So I was, stats-wise, I'm not sure everything was where it should have been. Had a bit higher critical strike. That's not necessarily bad for DPS classes. So didn't really look into stats or anything like that. So I think maybe if you increased your mastery a little bit, which just increases the the holy damage you do. I think you might have a little easier time. That was probably maybe my only feedback playing. With Holy Paladin having a little more haste helped, I don't really know that it made much of a difference on Retribution. So, on tier 15, I took Zeal. Judgment empowers you with Holy Zeal, causing your next 3 auto attacks to occur 30% faster and deal an additional holy damage. So I believe they actually changed this, because I remember when this was an actual usable ability. Around, I'm going to say Legion. And a Warlord's Legion. Somewhere in there. However, a couple of these abilities, Zeal, Define, Judgment, they work well as finishers. I know there's some talent, I believe, like Hammer of Wrath used to be like a baseline ability. I do remember Retribution having a finishing move that you could only use, similar to Warrior, where you could only use it on the target, once their health fell past a certain percentage. So changing Zeal, as I remember it, it was something similar to Blade of Justice. It had... I remember this having 2 charges. I don't know if that was a talent or if I'm just confusing this with something else. But I know Zeal, I'm pretty sure it had 2 charges when it was a usable ability. Generated like 2-3 charges of holy power. Did just kind of a massive amount of damage, if I'm remembering correctly. So it wasn't my first choice. After using it, I'm a little more convinced this is maybe the default for this tier. I was looking at Execution Sentence until I realized it takes 3 charges of holy power, which I have learned that if you have a class that has its own resource, as Paladins do with holy power, and you have trouble generating that, maintaining that, picking more abilities that use that's not going to help. I would think that would be common sense, but since it was more of a since it was... Yeah, I thought this was an AoE. They might have changed it. Because it doesn't say that it is. I remember using this at the end of Warlords. Execution Sentence. It was Hammer of Light and Holy Prism were all on the same tier. And this was the one everybody picked. And they all kind of did essentially the same thing, some kind of damage and healing. They just did it in slightly different ways. Yeah, once I saw that it took 3 charges of holy power, though, I kind of ruled this out because I said, well, I can't use Templar's Verdict or Divine Storm as much as I would like. So again, that kind of changed a little bit, kind of got better when I kind of swapped some of the other talents around. Yeah, there's just... Plus, it really just didn't fit into my rotation anywhere. I thought about this for a while. I kind of glanced at them, and I said, well, maybe I could switch, switch things around here. And then I thought, well, where would I actually work it in? to my rotation at. And with the way that I was playing, there just really wasn't a convenient way to do it. So with that and the fact that it cost 3 charges of holy power, that was really kind of the big deterrent for me. I kind of ruled this out. I looked at Righteous Verdict because I do use Templar Verdict as your big damage dealer. But it just increases the damage of your next Templar's Verdict for 6 seconds. And quite frankly, I'm not confident enough that I can generate enough holy power to use Templar's Verdict twice in 6 seconds. Most times, I imagine I probably can. Again, especially with some changes that I've made. However, Zeal works all the time. I really don't have to do anything. It's more convenient. As I often do, I tend to prefer the passive abilities. This is why I don't have to worry about my rotation or my, holy power kind of management. I don't have to worry about a buff running out or anything. This works just whenever. And when you think about actually using these 3 in practice, Zeal actually gets more use of the 3. So, again, kind of works a little bit like a finisher. I would say would be the best way to describe this. There are a couple abilities, as I said, that kind of together they work well as kind of a finisher. Again, I've had quite a few mobs around me, and you pop a shield, I used Divine Storm a few times, maybe Templar's Verdict, just to kind of thin out the mob a little bit. And Zeal definitely helps. So especially if you are, I also noticed that if you have say 5 or 6 mobs around you, if you get a proc for like Templar's Verdict or something, you're actually better just switching to a new target. Because it does 11... Currently it does over 11,500 damage. So, bearing in mind we had a stat squish, you'd be better off to use this on a different target and then Divine Storm again if you can, just to kind of bring everybody's health down a little bit more evenly, if that makes sense. Not necessarily what I would normally do on a DPS class. Generally, you try to take down one target at a time. However, I just kind of kept playing around with Divine Storm, basically more towards the end, and just kind of kept using it whenever it was available and I had a bunch of mobs around me. And by itself, it just doesn't seem like it does enough. When you use it in combination, like I said with Templar's Verdict, you keep kind of switching targets when you realize you have a, kind of a burst damage available. Retribution Paladins are very good, I would say, at more like burst damage style gameplay. And I think that was kind of always their thing. Again, didn't really play it much back in the day, so I'm not entirely sure. I always just kind of messed around with it kind of in short bursts. And then always went back to Holy or Protection or something like that. Not a big melee person. That's changing somewhat nowadays. It kind of really more depends on the class, since we can switch more freely between specs. So, yeah, Zeal definitely helps to kind of just finish off those weaker targets so you can focus on the ones with more health, basically. The tier 30 talent, as I said, Blade of Justice is your big holy power generator. So this was the default here, Art of War, which... There we go. Your auto attacks have a chance to reset the cooldown of Blade of Justice. So there you go. Art of War resets the cooldown of Blade of Justice 100% more often and increases its damage by 25%. So that was, for me, the default here. And this seems to work fairly well from what I've seen. Didn't have trouble getting the procs. Again, it only generates 2 charges of holy power, though. So you either need to use this in quick succession, because the charges will disperse after so long. Or you need to use it in combination with like Crusader Strike or Judgment, what have you. Still, getting the extra procs is not bad, and this does a fair amount of damage. So, and it can be used at range. So 12 yards, which is not great, but it's not terrible. It's better than melee range. So you can kind of open with this and set yourself up a little bit with your rotation. So Hammer of Wrath is a finishing move that requires the target to have less than 20% health. So don't really care for finishing moves generally. You can use it while you have Avenging Wrath active. I don't use Avenging Wrath enough to feel like I would make adequate use of this. Might be something I go back and look at later, maybe. I didn't mind it when it was a baseline talent, as I remember. It has a specific requirement that just only allows you a very short window when you're allowed to use it. Fires of Justice reduces the cooldown on Crusader Strike by 50% and grant a 50% chance to make your next ability consume 1 less holy power. So this is basically just RNG, essentially. I've noticed that abilities with anything lower than like a 20% chance are kind of iffy in BFA. There was a monk, well, for that matter, there was a monk ability that said 25%, and playing around, I could almost assure you that it was not proccing 25%. It was a much lower chance than that. Now, that said, I have noticed Holy Paladin has kind of a similar talent. A couple different similar talents that do the same thing. Once you use an ability, you have a percentage chance of doing something else. It does, with something like this, it's important to look at the ability that it wants you to use and figure out how often you use that ability. Again, sounds like common sense. I use Crusader Strike enough. This might be worthwhile. At that point, do you sacrifice the damage to take a chance to use abilities more often? And if you don't get that chance, are you going to be falling behind a bit in damage. This is kind of where some theory crafting comes in here. Theory crafting and kind of based on your playstyle. I use Blade of Justice quite a bit, so I still feel like this would be more the default talent. Unless you had a specific reason to take one of the other ones. If you find yourself using Avenging Wrath quite a bit, this doesn't seem like a bad ability. It can be used at range. It's not a melee ability. Fires of Justice, I mean, it's not great. It's just kind of one of those lesser abilities that seems like it kind of rounds out the choices you have for the tier. Blade of Wrath does two things on a much higher percentage, which seems to work as it says it does. So, yeah, this probably comes down to personal choice here and playstyle, I would say. Blade of Wrath, though, it's going to be... I think it would be difficult to make an argument for one or the other over this. I think this pretty well has a good lead over the other two. Tier 45 is just some kind of CC. I took Fist of Justice because I use Hammer of Justice. Well, I thought I was going to use it more than I have. The only other choice I would have would be Blinding Light. Blinding Light just really has no no purpose, for lack of a better term, for what I was doing. Just going back and doing the war campaign. That's pretty much all I've done on Retribution. I haven't done... I think I've done 1 or 2 battlegrounds, and that's been it. So, this has helped kind of in emergency situations. Again, as you're kind of fighting mobs, different ones kind of wander in and whatnot. So, yeah, not a bad ability. Hammer of Justice is one of the better stuns in the game. So, 1 minute's not bad for a 6-second stun. So, yeah, again, kind of pretty well comes down to personal preference here. I've played with all 3 of these, and Blinding Light, I think, is more what I go with, just to have kind of an AoE crowd control. Depending on the other choices and the single target CCs you have available, I tend to lean more towards having a AoE crowd control. It just seems to come in useful a little more often. So, yeah. The tier 60 talents. Again, this was one I kind of had to go back and look at again. Divine Judgment, as I said earlier, kind of Zeal and Divine Judgment. Each target hit by an ability that consumes holy power increases the damage of judgments by 20%, stacks up 15 times. This was what I was referring to when I said some of these abilities are kind of wonky. On its own, Judgment is not a bad ability. It can be used at range, 30-yard range. That's more on par with the other abilities in the game. It does pretty good damage for what it does. And it increases the damage of your next Holy Power ability. So being able to increase that damage, I tend to go to I tend to use either Templar's Verdict and then Judgment together. And that pretty well, like half of the target's health generally is pretty well gone at that point. Or I will use Judgment more kind of as a finisher, since it's a ranged ability. As I've said, when you get a proc for... when you either have the Holy Power or you get a proc to use Templar's Verdict or Blade of Justice, what have you, it's better just to switch to a new target, so you're not wasting any of your damage. So you can kind of target back, use Judgment, finish off a low health target, and then focus back on your current target. So I did think about this. I normally, abilities like this that stack up damage, I'm kind of on the fence about. There's some good ones and there's some not so good ones, lesser so. Consecration just really didn't make any sense. It does generate holy power. I did think about this. It just didn't seem to make any sense for what I was doing and how I was playing, because I was moving around a lot, and even for protection, it's difficult to keep consecration down, and consecration directly works with protection's mastery. So if you're having trouble with it in that setup, you're certainly going to have some trouble, difficulty with it in a DPS spec. Wake of Ashes. Again, I really thought about this. It's a super good ability. Does a massive amount of AoE damage. It is only to enemies in front of you. That was kind of the drawback for me. And reduces their movement speed. It does generate 5 holy power, though. Abilities that only affect targets in front of you, I have no luck with. And again, for what I was doing, because I was kind of going back looking at my talents periodically. As I was completing chapters, and I had a lot of mobs in front of me, but they were also around me, so it just seemed like it maybe wasn't as beneficial as it could be. And I found myself using Judgment, specifically going to Judgment to take advantage of the passive quite a bit. So I just kind of left it. I just kind of looked back over these a couple times, really thought, is there any advantage? Would this have helped with anything I just did? And for the most part, just settled on Divine Judgment. So that seemed to work well with my playstyle. This is a good example of an ability that seems a bit odd when you first see it, and then in practice works really well with how you play. So how your playstyle with the class and or character, I'll say. So the level 15 or tier 15 abilities are actually very similar. I believe all 3 specs have Unbreakable Spirit and Cavalry. I originally took Unbreakable Spirit and just decided that I wasn't using the abilities enough. It reduces the cooldown of Divine Shield, Shield of Vengeance, or Shield of Protection if you are a Holy Paladin, and lay on hands by 30%. So it's not at all a bad passive. You just have to be just have to be able to take advantage of it by using the abilities that it affects, and I just wasn't. I typically didn't have to use Divine Shield. I was perfectly fine in getting by with Shield of Vengeance, which just gives you a massive shield, basically. And then when it expires, inflicts holy damage equal to the total amount absorbed divided among all nearby enemies. So there you go. Which again sounds somewhat more impressive than it actually is in practice. Nice ability. Just if you cut that in half, you think, oh, it does 20,000 damage divided among enemies. The key word there is divided among. The divided diminishes it quite a bit in some parts of the war campaign I did where there were a lot of either a lot of mobs or a lot of mobs in a small area. So the thing I miss, the thing I found myself going to was Divine Steed, and it only had one charge, and I was like, yeah, that's not working. So roughly somewhere around halfway through completing the first part of the war campaign, I looked and saw that cavalry was available, so I just went ahead and took that. For me, mobility is much more important than having all my shield on a reduced cooldown. So I don't need to use lay on hands. Selfless healer works with that, so that wasn't an issue. I'm able to get by with Flash of Light. Eye for an eye. Surround yourself with a bladed bulwark, reducing physical damage taken by 35% and dealing physical damage to any melee attackers for 10 seconds. Not a bad ability. It just kind of seems like it does what I already have abilities that it does the same thing that I already have baseline abilities that do. If that made sense. So I don't need another shield. I don't need another shield / DPS. Again, when you kind of take in, Zeal, Divine Judgment, Shield of Vengeance, what have you, all these things together, they actually do a pretty decent amount of damage. I was pleasantly surprised. They just don't work well kind of on their own in pieces, kind of fragmented, if you will. So cavalry, again, for me, this was probably, it's kind of an odd selection of abilities. You could argue maybe cavalry was the odd one out here, because it really, at least Unbreakable Spirit and Eye for an Eye both have something to do with shields. So Unbreakable Spirit affects shields you already have. Eye for an Eye basically is another shield. Cavalry is just kind of a movement ability. So it's nice to have, though, just to have a little more mobility, at least for me anyway. So kind of the same thought I had with Unholy. If you find yourself needing your shields off cooldown more often, or if you for whatever reason find yourself using lay on hands more often than what the cooldown allows, by all means I would say take this. It's not at all a bad ability. I just wasn't taking advantage of it enough to really make it worthwhile. Or if for some reason you found, wanted to play around, found use with Eye for an Eye, to me it just seemed like I was duplicating abilities I already had. So Again, movement is generally not a bad thing in most situations, whether you're questing, raiding, doing a battleground. Movement is generally a good thing. So especially on some, admittedly, I didn't use it on some kind of mini bosses, elite, what have you. They had some AoE abilities where you needed to move to one place or the other. This can potentially help. I just kind of popped a shield and just tried to fight my way through it. Since I was a little better geared, I just kind of kept an eye on my health. It wasn't really affecting it too much. So, yeah. And then the tier 90. This is, I remember when Word of Glory was baseline. It is not on any spec now. Holy Paladin doesn't even have it at all anymore. Nor does Protection Paladin. I don't think it's a talent. I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure it's not. Yeah, I did kind of take a second look at this. I chose Selfless Healer. Your holy power spending abilities reduce the cast time of your next flash heal by 25% and increase its healing by 10%, stacks up 4 times. So that is extremely good. That is almost a overpowered passive right there. Initially I had Flash of Light on a different command bar, and I actually moved it up here because I realized this slot was empty, and I said, well, on my protection, as protection, I have my heal here. You get a baseline heal to help you tank. I said, well, I'm just going to leave it here to take it more, to take advantage of the passive, and that seems to that seemed to work well. Like I said, that kind of helped take care of the minor issue I was having with my health. I wasn't dying. I just noticed my health just seemed to like 25% of my health was like instantly gone whenever I would enter combat. So between this and realizing kind of what Blessing of Kings does, and Greater Blessing of Kings, excuse me, yeah, it kind of took care of that. So I briefly thought about the only downside with this is if you need to use Flash of Light back to back, you're using mana at that point with a bit of a slower cast time. So on the other side of that, though, nothing else uses mana. Everything uses holy power for the most part. So yeah, none of these other abilities do. So it's not as though you're going to be low on mana. So it's a minor inconvenience for what it does. And generally, once I use Flash of Light once or twice, whether I have the Selfless Healer proc or not, I'm generally able to get through whatever combat I'm in, and then take a minute to get my health back up. So it's not a big deal. I did look at Word of Glory, as I said, just to see if there was any more benefit. It does heal for more. Again, though, it takes 3 charges of holy power, and it has a 1 minute recharge. Selfless Healer has no cooldown. And neither does Flash of Light. So, potentially, in theory, I can get 2 Flash of Lights with the passive effects if everything worked correctly. If I got the procs and was able to buff this up twice, I could use it back to back with the passive increase. So, not terrible. Blade, Justicar's Vengeance. Focuses holy energy to deliver a powerful weapon strike that deals a large amount of holy damage and restores health equal to the damage done. Damage is increased by 50% used against a stunned target. So, again, a bit of a kind of like cavalry. A bit of a weird talent considering what the other ones do. I've used this before. I remember when this came out. Pretty sure like the end of Warlords. It uses 5 holy power. If I'm having trouble generating 3, 5 is going to be an even bigger problem. Not to mention the fact that if you need to heal, you don't generally want to be having to generate another resource to heal. It's very reminiscent of Death Knight's Death Strike. It does a large amount of damage, grant you. However, as I said, I'm really not using mana on anything else. So, you know, with or without Selfless Healer, it's better with Selfless Healer. When you get 4 stacks, Flash of Light will actually proc and light up to let you know. This can heal about half my health. And I have 156k right now. And so roughly, yeah, it's been roughly in there. I really didn't get too many different pieces of gear that was an upgrade between Time Walking and Najjar and everything. So yeah, I mean, not bad. Like I said, almost overpowered for a passive, which is rare to say at the very least. So you could potentially take Word of Glory, depending what other setup you went with. Justicar's Vengeance, I think, with a 5, requiring 5 holy power, I think is a bit of a drawback, a bit of a tough sale. Even with everything it did. I think I took it before just because it did a lot of damage, and it was similar to, as I said, similar to the Death Knight's Death Strike. Yeah, worked pretty well, all things considered. Yeah. And then the Tier 100. Now, this was what seemed to make the biggest difference. I originally took Inquisition. Consumes 1 to 3 holy power, so not bad. Consume up to 3 holy power to increase your damage done and haste by 7%. Last 15 seconds per holy power consumed. So, the 2 things that this has going for it is that it can use 1 to 3 holy power, and it lasts for 15 seconds per holy power consumed. So what is that, like 45 seconds if you use 3, I believe? Yeah. Which is not bad for a buff that increases your damage. The thing was, it was the reason I swapped it out was the fact that it did consume holy power. I was using this when there were times I should have been using Templar's Verdict or Divine Storm, because it seemed like I needed the increased damage and haste. So when I took a look at this, I swapped it out for Divine Purpose, which has a chance to proc your Holy Power abilities. Your abilities that consume Holy Power have a 50% chance to make your next ability that consumes Holy Power free and deal 20% increased damage and healing. So there you go. Kind of hard to argue with that. And this is where once I swapped talents around and took Divine Purpose, that's when this all kind of started to make more sense. And I had an easier time at it. So, yeah. Crusade replaces Avenging Wrath. Increases damage done. Each Holy Power spent increases during Crusade, increases damage and haste. So a combination of basically combines Inquisition in with Avenging Wrath. Again, I just don't use Avenging Wrath that much to make this worthwhile, and the issue I was having was with getting enough charges of Holy Power to use my bigger damage dealing abilities like Templar's Verdict, or being able to use an AoE ability. Divine Storm's the only AoE ability you have outside of like something like the Shield of Vengeance, the damage that Shield of Vengeance does. Yeah, so there you go. Not terrible. I mean, not terrible choices either, considering everything. One of the better talent trees, I use that term loosely for lack of a better word, to choose from. So, and then for just because I had war mode turned on, I'm not sure if that always functioned in different parts of the war campaign. I was using Luminescence. When you are healed by an ally, all nearby allies within 20 yards are also healed for 20% of the amount. Law and Order, your Hand of Hindrance, which I never really used, is dispelled and otherwise removed early. The cooldown is reduced by 15 seconds. Your Blade of Justice applies Hand of Hindrance to the target for 3 seconds, and then Justification increases the range of your Hammer of Justice by 10 yards. So there you go. Don't really know that I thought these through. I think I might have just taken something to stop the little notification from popping up, because they will tell you insistently when you have a new spot available until you pick something. So, yeah. But that was what I used for the to complete the war campaign. Didn't really have. It's not really all that difficult if you do it at 120. I think the later parts you have to wait until 120. As I said, I was a little better geared, so I didn't really have too many issues with anything. The healing could be better. The self-healing could be better if I had to pick something, and the Holy Power generation could be better. If I had to pick a major and a minor issue, the Holy Power generation, I would say, would be somewhat of a major issue if they wanted to look to change something, and then the self-healing would be somewhat of a minor issue. I really didn't have too much of a problem with it. I just had to keep an eye on my health, which I suppose I'm spoiled with the way the game has been going towards a more a more kind of scaled back playstyle, shall we say. So having to actually, keep an eye on my health and also watch, kind of run through my rotation at the same time was a bit more kind of multitasking than I'm used to. A little more kind of dueling back and forth. In most cases, I was able um, to kill whatever enemy, whatever mobs before they did too much damage to me. There were a few rare occasions, though, for whatever reason, where I did die to one thing or another. Usually was to my own fault, to my own incompetence for one reason or another. I either maybe went AFK, or there was a cutscene or something happened, and I just wasn't paying attention. And yeah, they don't always put you in the most opportune spot to start a different phase or chapter, depending on what you're doing. So I think in total, the times I died were, you could probably count on one hand. I mean, it was not a lot at all. So yeah. So there you go, folks. There was State of for Retribution Paladin. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you found that useful, helpful, and thank you for watching.